I've got our React Redux blog project open here on the left, and on the right I've got DevTools open, and it's the React DevTools. I used the profiler to record our application every time I clicked the thumbs up emoji for the first post. And as you can see from the three screens that I have, every time I click that emoji, I re-rendered all 100 posts, even though the emoji is just for the first post. Today we'll fix that and apply some other optimizations to our application. Hello and welcome. I'm Dave. Today we're going to apply optimization techniques to our React and Redux Toolkit blog project to increase the performance of the application. I'll provide links to example source code and all resources in the description below. Please note this tutorial is not for absolute beginners in React. It is for those that already know React and are beginners with Redux and Redux Toolkit. If you are a React beginner, you should complete the React.js for Beginners full course on my channel, or one like it at a minimum, before attempting this Redux series. Okay, I've got Visual Studio Code open here, and we're at the edit post form of the starter code. Now you can download this starter code from the link in the description below, or if you've been working through this series with me, maybe you've already got it. And that's what I want to address before we get started with anything else. One thing from the previous tutorial in this series in the edit post form.js, and that is on the onAuthor changed. I don't believe in the previous tutorial I wrapped this value in number, and it needs to be a number, otherwise it saves a string and then the comparison doesn't work and you don't get the updated author. Now again, this was already changed in the repository for the starting code, so if you've just downloaded that, you've already got this here. Now before I apply optimizations today, I want to add a couple of quick features that will help me demonstrate these optimizations. The first one is going to be in the users folder, and we're going to create a users list. So I'll start a new file and name this users with a capital U and then list with a capital L.js. Nothing really new in the file, so I'll just paste in the ingredients and we'll quickly cover this. Now I'll get rid of that extra line at the top, but we're importing useSelector as we have before, and our select all users selector, and then link from React Router DOM. And then inside the component, we are getting the users by calling the useSelector here and passing in the select all users selector that we created in the UsersList. And then we render the users. So inside of rendered users is an array full of these list items because we're calling map over all of the users. And then each user gets their own link. And then, of course, it links to an individual page for each user based on that user ID. And then you can see we just return the rendered users here at the end of the component. And so that's essentially the entire users list component. Now we need to create the user page for each user. But before we do that, we need to go to the UsersList and create a selectByUserId selector. So let's scroll down. And once we get down to the bottom here, just under select all users, we'll add some space. I'll paste this in just to go a little faster, but it's really easy to create. We call it selectUserById, gets the state and the user ID, and then we just call the user state here, state.users, and then find on that, and we return what matches the user.id to the user ID that we pass in. And of course we have export here, so it's ready to go, and we'll be able to import it into the user page that we create. So now let's create this new component, and we'll call it user, not users, but just user singular page with a capital P.js. This component doesn't have much new either, so I'll paste this in. Now, of course, it's going to be able to display any given user that has their data passed in. So at the top, we have useSelector, and then we're importing that selectUserById that we just created in the UsersList. We're also importing select all posts. And then from React Router, we're importing link and the useParams hook. So we're going to get that user ID out of the URL. And that's what we're doing right here as we call useParams. We're grabbing that user ID. Now note that will be a string as it comes from the URL. So we need to wrap it in number once again when we pass it into a selector. And that's what we're doing here to get the user. we're calling useSelector, and of course inside that it receives the state, and then we use that selector we created, selectByUserId, which receives the state and the user ID that must be wrapped as a number. And then we have posts for user, because what we want to do is not only get the user, we want to display a list of all of their posts. So once again, we use useSelector, we pass in the state, and then we use selectAllPosts inside of the useSelector to define all posts. And then we call filter on all posts and return the result where the post.userId matches the user ID. So we get all of the posts that belong to any given user, and then we list those out, and now we link the titles of those posts to a specific post ID page, which we've already created in a previous tutorial. So we can go to a specific post for any given post. They have their own page already. And then, of course, down here, we're just displaying the name in an H2 and all of those post titles with their links. And that is the end of the user page component. All right, with those components created and this selector created in the UserSlice, we're ready to go to the App.js. Now, just under the import of the edit post form, we're going to import UserList, and we're going to import UserPage. After that, we need to scroll down, and this will look a lot like the path to the post information here, where we have route path equals post, but this will be for user. And I'll paste this in, I'll save to get some better formatting. And we can see we've got our path user, then there's an index route, and it's going to display the user list component. And then if the route has an ID, a user ID at the end of it, then it's going to display the user page component. And while we're in the app.js, let's scroll up. I need to import navigate from React Router DOM, and we're going to add a catch-all page. Now you could create a 404 and display it, but what I'm going to do is just put essentially a redirect here with navigate, and we'll navigate back to the home page if any page doesn't exist. But as I note here in a comment, you could replace with a 404 if you want to. And this is a catch-all. It's got the asterisk here, which is going to select any route that makes it past these other routes. So if it doesn't match any of these, then it will be grabbed here, and then it's just going to redirect to the home page with navigate. Notice I've got the replace flag here also, and that's going to replace the bad request, whatever that address or page was that didn't exist. It's going to replace that in history with the good address that we're sending the user to. Now we're almost finished with this and ready to test it out, but first let's go to the components directory, go to the header, and here after the post link, I'm going to press Shift Alt and the down arrow to copy that line down, and then we'll just change this to user. But then here, instead of post, I'm going to say users, because it's actually going to display a users list. So I'll save that change as well. And now we're ready to test it out. So I'm going to press Control and the backtick, type npm start to start up our app, and then drag Visual Studio Code to the left, click on Chrome so we can see what comes up, and we'll see if we have any errors or if everything is working as expected. And here's our blog. It appears everything is working as expected. We see users up here in the top right, so I will click on that. And now we have our users page, and we have our list of users. So I'll just click on the first user. And now we have Leanne Graham from the data that we're getting from JSON placeholder, which is the data source for this blog that we're making an example of. And then we have 10 posts, and of course this is lorem ipsum text here, but these different 10 titles of posts, and we can click one and go to any specific post as well. So it all worked out like we expected it to. And let's click and go back to users, and everything looks pretty good here. Now we need to add one more feature before we can apply these optimizations that I would like to. So I'm going to grab Chrome, drag it to the right, grab Visual Studio Code, let it fill out the page, close the terminal, and head over to the PostsSlice. And inside the PostsSlice, we're going to add a simple counter. Now, it really has no purpose in the blog, but it's going to be a nice review for implementing some new state with Redux, and it's also going to help me demonstrate some optimizations. So to do that, we're going to start out here in our initial state, and I'll put a comma, and then I'll just put a count value of 0 to go along with the rest of the initial state. Next, we're going to scroll down past all of our async thunks, and get down to the createSlice where we have our reducers. Now, we're not using post-added anymore ever since we applied our async thunks. So I can really eliminate that. And if we come down here all the way, I'll just select it all and hit backspace. So we still have our reaction added. Now, underneath reaction added, I'm going to go ahead and put in the other reducer that we have here. And that is going to be increase count. It's very basic. It accepts state and action just like reaction added does. But then we're just taking state count and we're adding 1 to it. Now again, you can write code that looks like it mutates the data inside of createSlice. We can only do this inside of createSlice. And so that's what we're doing here, just kind of like you see here with the reactions as well. So you might see code that looks like it would mutate the data, but Emmer.js is running underneath the hood only inside of the createSlice, and that's why we can do it here. And now we need to create another selector for our count. So we'll scroll all the way down here to our selectors. I'll click on the last one in that grouping where get post error is, and we'll just change this then to get count. And then it's going to be state.posts.count. Now, action creator functions are automatically created when we put a reducer in the createSlice portion of the slice. So we removed that post added, and so now we can add what we created, which is called increase count. So we need to export that action creator function. Now we can save our changes here in the slice, and what we're going to do is go to the header component where we were just a little bit ago to add this users link, and we're going to apply the counter to this component. So underneath our import of link, I'm just pasting in the other imports, but we have useDispatch and useSelector from React Redux. And then we have increase count and get count from the postsSlice. So then we need to define our dispatch here. So we'll say const dispatch equals useDispatch. And after that, we also need to get our count. So there we're going to use the selector we imported, and we'll use get count that we created. And finally, in the nav, after the unordered list, I'm just going to paste in a button. When I save, it formats better. But this button has an on click, and that's where we dispatch the increase count function. And then we have the count state on the button. So that's all there is to it, really. Let's drag Visual Studio Code back to the left, and let's see what error we have. It says get count is not found inside of the postsSlice. So let's see what's going on with that. I'll need the full screen to figure that out. Let's look at the postsSlice, and let's see if we have get count. Oh, I spelled it wrong. I had an R at the end. Once I remove that R and save, we should be good to go. Okay, let's drag this back to the left. It looks like it's working now. And now everything seems to be working. Here's our button in the very top right, and if I click it, we should see it increment. Yep, went right up to 5 after 5 clicks. And now we're ready to make our first optimization. And what you need here, at least to record and see that you need to make optimizations, is React DevTools. Now I'm going to open up DevTools by right-clicking and choosing Inspect. You could also press Control, Shift, and the letter I. But once you're in DevTools, then you want to select the couple of greater than signs here that allow you to see more tabs essentially. And once you have React DevTools, which I'll link to in the description, so if you don't have those, you can get it for free at the Chrome Web Store, and it's an extension you install for Chrome. And I believe it's available for other browsers as well. We're going to choose the profiler here. And once we have the profiler, it wants us to start a recording. Well, I'm going to go to the page for Leanne Graham over here on the left. So now we're at an individual user page. And then I'm going to start recording our app. And I'm going to go ahead and click the button 5 more times. After I've done that, I'm going to stop recording, and now we can see the components here, and we have 5 pages to arrow through. And we're seeing what rendered. So we can see this orange indicates the header rendered, and that's correct because the state changed. But notice what else happened. The user page also rendered, and that's kind of strange because the user page isn't related to the count at all. The count's in the header, and that state really has nothing to do with the user page other than they're both kept in the postsSlice. So if we arrow through our pages here, we'll see that the user page is rendering every time that the header was updated, and we still see that. And so that's kind of strange and really not what we want. So why is that happening? Let's go back and take a look at our code once again. I'll drag this over so it takes up the full page, but we need to look at the code of the user page component. So here inside of the user page component, I'm going to scroll up until we see the posts for user definition. And here we're using the use selector. We pass in the state. Then we select all posts with the select all posts selector, and then we're returning all posts, but it's filtered. And this is where we run into a problem. There's really nothing wrong with filter. It just returns a new array every time, and use selector will run every time an action is dispatched. And so when we dispatch that increase count in the header, then the use selector runs again, and it forces a component to re-render if a new reference value is returned. We're returning a new value every time with filter, so that's why we're rendering the user page. And we can fix all of this by creating a memoized selector. So let's go back to the postsSlice and learn how to do this. So back here in the postsSlice, I'll find it in the list over here on the left. I want to scroll to the top first, and let's look at our imports here. We have createSlice, nanoID that we're no longer using, so we can remove that. We have createAsyncThunk, and after that I'm going to import createSelector, and we'll use that to create this memoized selector. So let's scroll down now to our selectors all the way towards the bottom, and we'll find here we have select post by ID. This is going to be just a little bit different. This is going to be select post by user. So when I save, I think I'll get the formatting I want. Yes, so here we have select posts by user, and we're using our create selector. Create selector accepts one or more input functions, and notice they're inside of brackets like an array. That should be your first clue that these are dependencies. Actually, the values returned from these functions are the dependencies, and they provide the input parameters for the output function of our memoized selector. So if the select all post value changes, or this anonymous function, which is taking state and user ID, and it's simply returning the user ID, we just need the user ID, so we have to write a simple function to do that because these are input functions. But then if posts or the user ID changes, essentially, that's the only time that we'll get something new from this selector. That's the only time that it will rerun, so it's memoized. So with this added now to our slice, let's go back to our user page and use this memoized selector. So let's find the user page. There it is. Now at the top, we've already got select user by ID. This is going to be coming from the postsSlice as well, and this is select posts by user. So I'll just put it after our select all posts. And now that we've imported it, let's use it inside of the file. So we'll come down here where we were previously calling filter and creating that new value, and we'll just replace everything that we had for the post for user, and now we'll use our new selector that we've created. I'm going to press Control B so we can see everything, but here we're using use selector once again, passing in the state, but now we're using this new memoized selector we created, select posts by user ID. It gets the state. Once again, we're making sure it's a number because we're getting that from useParams, where it's a string from the URL, and then we're passing that user ID in. So now that we've made these changes, let's go ahead and drag Visual Studio Code to the left. Let's go back, let's clear out the changes here, and let's see if we need to reload or make any other changes if we're getting everything we expect. We are not getting our posts currently. Let's go back and quickly check our code. There may be something wrong with that selector we created, so I'll double check that. That's back in the postsSlice. As I'm looking through this, yes, there is a problem. We've got post.user. I should have put post.userId, and that's what we need to check. So once I make that change, we go back, and now we'll of course make the Chrome browser, fill up the page, and yes, now we've got all the posts here on the individual user page. So we're once again ready to check. So what I'm going to do is start recording again with React DevTools, clicking the number button 5 times and stopping. Notice what happened now. As we look on our first page even, we can see that we've got it right. We're rendering the header. We're not rendering the user page anymore. So on each of these attempts, we did not re-render the user page. And that's why I wanted to add a counter, just to give something that was completely not a reference to what we had in the other component, and really out of the way as well, to just show how one can impact the other if you do not apply the optimization correctly. So now that we have this memoized selector, we're not re-rendering the user page every time we increase the count. Okay, with this problem solved, I'm going to clear out the profiler again. Let's go back to the home page, and while we're here, I'll start recording a profile again. I'm just going to click thumbs up about 3 times again and stop the profile. And let's see what we're getting. So every time I clicked the thumbs up, we got not only the post list, but every individual post excerpt was also rendered. So we've got 100 of those. So 1 thumbs up meant re-rendering all of these. And as I arrow through, you'll see they re-rendered every time we added a reaction. So we do need to fix that as well. And there's a couple of ways to do it. I'm going to drag Chrome back over to the right, and DevTools will fill up the screen. Not DevTools, VS Code will fill up the screen again. And now there is one quick way to do this that is definitely legitimate, and there's nothing wrong with doing it this way. However, we're going to look at a full-featured solution after this also. So what we're going to do first is just say import React from React. We don't usually have to do that, but in this case we will. We're going to change this const for PostsExcerpt to a let, and you'll quickly see why here, because after that we're going to set post, is it post or posts? It's posts with a plural s at the end, excerpt, and we'll set that equal to React.memo, and then we'll pass in PostsExcerpt. And what that does really is it allows this component to not re-render if the prop that it receives has not changed. So if the post does not change that's passed to PostsExcerpt, it will not re-render. So this easily solves the immediate problem that we have. So I'll just save that one change right there, and now I'll drag this back over. We'll go ahead and look at Chrome in the full screen again. I'll clear out our previous recording, and we'll go back home and we'll start a recording, and I'll click 3 more thumbs up, and now we'll stop the recording. And now look at our profile recording. We've got the post list, which is fine, and that's expected, but we're only rendering this first post excerpt, and of course anything that's nested in it. Here's the time ago component, which that's so small it doesn't really hurt a thing anyway. But overall, for this example, we just wanted that one post excerpt to render, and that's what happened. Let's look at the next page, same result, and the next page, same result. So now we eliminated that big list. Okay, there's nothing wrong with our React.memo solution, but I'm going to remove all of this, and I'll show you why, because we're going to talk about state normalization and just using normalized data overall, which is recommended. And then after this, I've got this last line to remove here. After this, we'll quickly discuss all of the benefits. Okay, normalized state structure is a recommended approach for storing items. And normalization means no duplication of data, and it also means keeping the items stored in a lookup table by item ID. So our normalized state shape is comprised of an object with an IDs array, and then a nested entities object that contains all of the items. And the best part of using normalized data with Redux Toolkit is that Redux Toolkit offers a createEntityAdapter API, and that will make your slices less complicated and easier to manage. Let's get started with normalized state back in the PostsSlice file. So we'll have to go back up to where the imports are, And you can see I'm getting kind of a long line here. I'll press Control B again for all the imports from Redux.js toolkit. And so instead of that, I'll just paste in the difference where I put them on each line. You can see we've got the 3 we were already using, but then I'm also adding the createEntityAdapter. Okay, next under our post URL, I'm going to paste this in, but it's a postsAdapter that we're going to create. And here we have the createEntityAdapter, and we can put a sort comparer function inside of the createEntityAdapter. Now this should look familiar because it's kind of like what we are using inside of the PostsList. So if I open the file tree quickly, look at the PostsList, we were previously applying a sort that looked much like that right here inside the component. So one thing I like about this already is we're abstracting this back to the slice instead of doing that logic in the component. So now let's go back to the slice again, and you can see that here where it does the sorting. Let's scroll just a little bit, and now instead of just our initial state, and I'm going to select down here through posts as well, we're going to have the postAdapter.getInitialState for the initial state. And notice I got rid of the empty array that was posts because our initial state will already, even if we didn't put anything else in it, it will already return that normalized object that I was talking about, where you have an array of the item IDs, and then you have that entities object that will actually have all the items. So that's there automatically, and this is the extra state we're adding on top of that. And now we may need to change some of our reducers and other functions. The async thunks are just fine, so let's scroll down and let's look at how we get the existing posts for our reaction added. Here we're using state.post.find, and we'll be able to change that. So now it's going to be state.entities, and we're passing in that post ID because we're using this as an object lookup. So the entities is an object, and then we're passing in the ID to look up that specific post. And now as we scroll down here into the builder cases, there are several to look at, and we're going to specifically be looking at the fulfilled cases. So when we get down here, instead of the state.post equaling state.post.concat and the loaded posts, we're going to change this now because this postAdapter has its own CRUD methods. So let's look at the first one, which is upsert many, and we just pass in the state and then the loaded posts. Now let's scroll down to the add new post where we have the fulfilled here, and once again, instead of state.post.push, I'll select that, and this has its own method as well. So it's postAdapter.addOne, and we pass in the state and the action payload, which is the new post. Now we're looking at updatePost.fulfilled, and as we get down here, instead of setting the state.posts equal to this new array where we spread in the posts and the action payload, we can use postAdapter.upsert1, pass in the state and the action payload once again. And finally, for the delete post fulfilled, instead of state.post equals posts, we'll just highlight that part and we postAdapter.remove1, pass in the state and the ID. So now you've noticed, of course, there's a line or two that we're not using. We're not using this posts line right here. And actually, if you didn't want to destructure the ID, you could say action.payload.id here and just have it right there instead of that line. But I kind of like just having it down to the ID myself. Also here in the update, we no longer need to define posts as well because we are just getting it from the action payload there as well. And here, we're not using this ID we destructured at all either. So we can remove that. I believe the rest is fine. Let me double check as I scroll up. Everything else, yep, looks good. So with that, we now need to scroll down to the selectors area. I'm going to save the changes we've made so far, and we'll be replacing some of these selectors because getSelectors is another method we're going to call that automatically creates some selectors that we would typically need. One of those would be the select all posts. So we can remove this, and And the other one would be select post by ID. So we can remove that as well. And then it's going to give us one new selector. I'll paste this in and we'll take a look. So here again, get selectors creates these selectors. Then we're using ES6 destructuring to give them aliases so they match up with our pre-existing code. So get selectors creates select all, select by ID, and then select IDs. We're going to, of course, name them select all posts that we already had, select post by ID that we already had, and then just to stick with that naming convention here, we'll say select post IDs. Notice we do need to pass in a simple state selector here, and we can do that with an anonymous function. So you do have to pass in a selector that returns the postsSlice of state right there. So postAdapter.getSelectors, pass in a selector for the state, but then it creates these three that we can export with these aliases that we are assigning using destructuring. I'll save, and I want to say we're finished, but VS Code is telling me there's an error up there, so I really want to check and see what I did that might have created a problem. And now I see the issue, export's underlined here because we have our get initial state, and then I just had a curly brace at the end, so if we put a parentheses around that, should be good. Now that's quite a few changes to the postsSlice to put this createEntityAdapter into action. However, once you get the hang of applying this postAdapter, it sure made things a lot easier, especially down here where we applied the CRUD methods. It also made it very easy to get the existing post here for reaction added as we got it from the entities object lookup. But then all of these different CRUD methods from upsert many, and then we had add one, and then upsert one, and eventually remove one. All of those make that pretty easy to work with. Now there are more methods, and I'll make sure to link to those in the description, or at least the documentation for those in the description. And now we need to make a couple of changes in the PostsList component to take advantage of the changes we just made in the postsSlice. So right up here at the top with the imports, now instead of select all posts, we're going to select the post IDs. So now we have select post IDs, and now we're going to change this post that we have with use selector all posts, which we're no longer importing, and we're going to define our ordered post IDs right here using the use selector and pass in the select post IDs. And then in the succeeded block here of our conditional with the if and loading status and then succeeded and then finally failed, we'll change what we have here because remember we're doing that sort compare function already inside the createEntityAdapter that's inside the postsSlice. We no longer need to sort here, and we'll set the content just a little bit differently because we're using the ordered post IDs. We'll map over that and we'll pass in post ID. So let's save these changes and now go to our PostsExcerpt that we did have the React.memo on, but we'll just make a few changes here as well. So now it's not just getting the post, it's getting the post ID. And we also need to go ahead and import a couple of things. So let's put the imports here. We'll have the use selector and the select post by ID selector that we've created. And then inside the component, we'll put those to work by calling, well, we'll have use selector here, and then we'll call the select post by ID when we pass in the state and the post ID that we received as a prop. After that, we'll have our post defined, and everything in the JSX should work as it was before. Okay, that's a lot of changes, but let's drag VS Code back to the left and let's look at our page. I'll clear out the profiler altogether for now, and let's just make sure everything's working first. So let's view a post. We've got a post here. We can edit the post. All of that looks good. And of course, here on the home page, we see all of the post excerpts as we expect. So now let's see what happens when we record the profile and we click on thumbs up 3 times. And now we'll stop the recording. Once again, it only rendered that very first post excerpt. So everything is working as expected with the normalized data. We simplified the postsSlice and we were able to use those adapter CRUD methods, and then it also created some selectors for us that we destructured and, of course, using aliases renamed what we already had in our code. But we simplified our code, we pulled more logic out of the components, put it in the postsSlice, and now this optimization stood the test of time here as far as rendering all of our post excerpts and only re-rendering the one that got the reaction. So those are some good optimizations to add into your Redux toolkit arsenal. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you. And thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.